welcome to March's Breaking Barriers LinkedIn Live, brought to you by DEI consultancy Shape Talent. I'm Rachel Schofield. I'm a senior facilitator with Shape Talent, and today I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Matt Jacobs to explore what is a big topic, an important topic, a very topical topic, which is the issue of masculinity in the workplace and how men benefit from gender equity. Hi, Matt. Great to have you with me.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Good. I'm going to introduce Matt to you properly in a moment. Matt is in Bristol. I'm in London. It would be really nice in the chat to know where you are. If you're joining us live, or indeed if you're watching this on replay, tell us where in the world you are. And that's a good chance for me to encourage you to use the chat, because this is a very informal space. We meet once a month. We bring in a fantastic guest to talk about breaking barriers, to share their experiences around diversity, equity and inclusion, and particularly to bring you practical insights for the workplace. But we want to hear from you as well. So please use the chat. Let us know what's resonating, what echoes your own experiences. If there are things that you think, oh, that's not something I've thought about, we want to know that. So as Matt and I are talking today, please use the chat, and specifically use the chat for questions as well. I'll give you a little prompt, because the plan today is that Matt and I will chat for about half an hour. And towards the end of that time, I will invite you to start using the chat for your questions. And believe me, you will have lots of questions for Matt, because he is fascinating on the topic. No, not setting the bar too high here, Matt, don't worry.
Yeah, no pressure then.
I know, because I've worked with you, but I know Matt is a highly qualified coach, facilitator, speaker. He's a consultant with 25 years experience in equity, diversity and inclusion. He has 3 degrees, not just a BA, but a master's and a PhD, and has done some really fascinating work in this space, both in a research capacity and obviously on a day-to-day basis as well. So Matt's doctoral research focused on how white, middle-class, heterosexual men performed their identities in response to the Me Too and Black Lives Matter campaigns. And in his professional life, Matt's experience ranges from working directly with those experiencing marginalisation to leading multi-million-pound programmes delivering impact at a city level. So I know, Matt, you're now working with organisations, the leaders from startups through to big multinational companies, aspiring to be inclusive for everyone. So that's your intro to Matt. I'm going to bring Matt in a moment, but I'm just going to dive into the chat, see what we are looking at. So hi, Don, who's in Amsterdam. Jessica is in Hampshire. And we've got Priscilla's in West Berkshire. We've got Cheltenham, London, Oxford calling. Good. Sun is shining. That's good. And hello, Sheffield. Hello, Barbara. Good to see you. Fantastic. So what can you expect today? Well, we wanted to choose this topic because there is so much noise around it at the moment. And I should say, with the time we've got available, the noise around masculinity is something we're going to have to contain a little bit, in the sense of what we are looking at today is specifically masculinity in the workplace, masculinity in the corporate world. Because, of course, as we've seen, Mark Zuckerberg reigniting discussions about masculinity at work. He's been arguing companies should embrace more masculine traits. We've seen, naturally, a flurry of executive orders from President Trump around DEI. So there's lots of discussion about this in the workplace. So what Matt and I are going to be talking about today is, what does masculinity really mean in a professional setting? How can we foster a really constructive understanding of it? And as we're seeing, why are some men disengaging from gender equity efforts? Because we want to talk about what organizations can do to foster more inclusive cultures, and really kind of make this an accessible topic for everyone. So Matt, that's enough from me. I'm going to bring you in by asking you a slightly cheeky question, but one I know you're very used to, which is that people take a look at you with all our, human judgments that we make, and say, here's a very friendly looking guy, but he's white, middle class, heterosexual. What's he doing in this space? And people, I'm sure, look at you as if to say, tell me more, I'm curious. So tell us more about what brings you here.
What brings me here? Yes, it is a question I get asked quite often, and there are long and short versions of the story. So conscious of time, I'll try and keep it short. I think there are kind of 3, maybe 4 different pathways here, or elements that come together here. The first one really is probably, an initial sort of left-leaning politics that made me quite conscious of class issues, right? Class division and class issues. And I think, I think I was inspired by my history teacher in school around those kinds of issues. And it was a woman as well. So, way back in the mists of time, I was inspired around class issues by a woman in school. But I think it fundamentally started when I changed careers in some respects. So I spent a few years knocking around in the music industry, but then got made redundant and realized that actually I wanted to do something a little bit more constructive, perhaps a little bit more productive as far as society was concerned. And I went to work initially with young people and young offenders and young men, in particular on white working class estates in Bristol. And then ultimately I worked at the local authority. And this is partly where some of this management of large amounts of money came into play. And that was operating at quite a strategic level around all sorts of issues to do with inclusion. And it was quite removed in some respects from the reality of life on the ground for people. And I should say at this point, one of the other parts here, one of the other influences here is that around that time, I also became, a single parent to two girls, two quite young daughters. And believe me, raising two girls as a man on your own is not only a privilege, but a hugely educational experience to become more aware of the issues that affect young women as they grow and into adulthood. But I left the city council and worked then for a school in inner city Bristol, which is one of the most socioeconomically disadvantaged wards, as well as one of the most diverse wards. And it was there that I was kind of really confronted with my whiteness, my white privilege, and just how easy it is for me to move through the world because of the color of my skin. And that's kind of then intersected with my class awareness and what I was learning about gender in relation to my children, and sparked much more sort of academic interest to explore, okay, what's going on here? How does this come about? And why is it that I have such inordinate intersectional privilege? And that research really kind of made me aware of the history of it all, and the fact that I have this ability to move through this world with such ease because of the actions of people who look like me for the last sort of 300, 400, 500, 600 years. And with that came this sense of, well, hang on a second, this isn't right. And I need to take some responsibility here. I need to do what I can. I need to be a little bit accountable for the actions of the people in the past that have led to this space where I have this inordinate privilege. So I need to learn more about it. I need to understand it more deeply, but I need to try and do something about it. And, there was no sense of guilt. We hear a lot of people talking about guilt in this space when confronted with privilege. There wasn't any guilt. There was just this deep sense of, okay, I need to do something about this. I'm responsible and I need to take some accountability. So that's why I'm here. That's why I do this work.
Yeah, and thank you for answering that, because that comes, I hope, from a place of curiosity, not confrontation. Like, everybody has a right to be in the space, and I love the journey that you shared with us. So thanks for being so kind of vulnerable about that. Let's dive into that topic then around masculinity in the workplace. And I guess the first thing we should do is it's such a big word and it's hard to pin down, but when we're defining masculinity, particularly in the context of corporate culture, where do we start? Well,
I think we have to look at masculinity on a couple of different levels, I think. I mean, we have to look at it as a societal phenomenon, and that obviously breaches the boundaries of the corporate world, but in both directions. So we have to look at masculinity from that as a societal phenomenon. And then we have to look at it from the perspective of an individual performance of masculinity. And if we start, they inform each other as well. So the societal level informs the individual performance, which then reinforces the societal level. So if we start with societal, basically masculinity is this kind of like umbrella term that refers to a number of different discourses that in one way or another convey the rules of what it means to be a man in society. And so you might, there are a whole number of different discourses, but the dominant ones are the ones that say that men have to be rational and unemotional. They have to be courageous and brave. They have to be ambitious. They have to be the breadwinner. They have to be successful. All these discourses that say this is what you have to do to be recognizable as a man in society. And they also then carry these kind of idealized standards of what that means. So if you think about James Bond of this world, these mythologized sort of fictional characters that embody these masculine traits, right? And these are the standards that we have to try and achieve as men in order to have value. So the further away you are from those standards, the less value you are perceived to have in society, and the more likely you are as a man to experience some kind of discrimination from other men, because there is this hierarchical process. So you have these rules and these standards that we have to try and ascribe to and attain. And I think we should probably just touch on intersectionality here again as well, on the basis that these masculinities discourses intersect with discourses of race, discourses of class as well. And so you'll find that the white middle class heterosexual man like me will be ascribed a greater level of value in society than, for example, a white working class man or a black or brown man. And I think it's just important that we don't forget, when we're talking about masculinity, that we need to engage with it intersectionally. So that's the kind of social phenomenon of masculinity, that men have to try and aspire to these rules and regulations. And then if you think about the corporate culture and the corporate world and the history of that, you know, depending on how far back you want to go, you can look at the history of its roots being perhaps in industrialization. We have to look at empire building. We have to look at war and conflict over the control of resources and markets, and how all of that is very masculinized and very competitive and hyper competitive. And that feeds into a sense of corporate culture. So also if we think about traditional leadership and the narratives around traditional leadership, which have a comparability to those ones about masculinity. So leaders are supposed to be rational, they're supposed to be unemotional, make the tough decisions. These are all kind of masculinized discourses. And all of those three combine together then into this corporate culture. And that can result in, for example, the bro culture, because men are trying to perform their individualized masculinity according to this discourse that says, this narrative that says you have to be a certain way, in a culture that says you've got to win all, you know, winner takes all, it's cutthroat, you know, you've got to dominate the markets, etc. So all of that intersects within the corporate environment to create this bro culture, hyper competitivity, the discrimination and marginalization of women, the biases against women because they don't fit in with that definition, they don't meet those ideals of leadership, etc. And so it becomes fundamentally a damaging environment in many respects, the way that that form of masculinity operates in the workplace. I should emphasize that it's not the only form of masculinity, but it is the predominant one, and it is the one that informs a lot of corporate culture at the moment, and creates a number of the problems that we see. Why we work in this field of gender equity, this is one of the sort of causal reasons.
Yeah. So see, as you said, the kind of the temptation is to, and because it's so topical at the moment, to think about, well, what are all these sort of bad bits of masculinity, particularly in the corporate world? What is pushed through that then shows up in an unhelpful way, both for men and for women, for all genders?
Yeah.
But when might masculinity be a positive thing? What are some of the elements in the workplace where we need to kind of say, we're not going to look at this in some stuff's good, some stuff's bad? How can we see it in a slightly more nuanced way, I wonder?
Well, I mean, I think one of the problems that we have in all of this work, when we're talking about gender, is how we ascribe certain traits and characteristics to one particular gender or another, right? Because, you know, if we talk about like positive leadership traits at the moment, the sort of leadership that we need in the marketplace today, when we're talking about empathy, we're talking about compassion, we're talking about relationships, etc., being relational, these are traits that are often ascribed to women. You know, they're more feminized characteristics, but in reality, men can be like that too. So I think it's kind of problematic when we say these are positive and negative aspects of masculinity and these are positive and negative aspects of femininity. I think what we need to be talking about is what is positive leadership, what are positive human behaviors. Otherwise, we end up making these distinctions between men and women, and we end up making value judgments about what's worse and what's better and what's not. And when we ascribe those better and worse to men or women, you create this problem that we see today in terms of this almost, you know, oppositional work. So, you know, men can be compassionate. We can be emotionally intelligent. We can demonstrate a vulnerability. You know, we can do all of these things that are positive, more typically associated with femininity, but shouldn't be. They should just be associated with humanity, I think.
And let's not, I'm mindful I mustn't jump over that piece of the puzzle around people like Mark Zuckerberg and the sort of pushback that we're starting to see, where he was saying we need more masculine energy in the workplace. And again, maybe he was being very binary, but do you think there is something here of a kind of broader trend in corporate culture where people are saying, whether they're attributing it to male and female or just saying we mustn't lose sight of those masculine traits, whoever they belong to, that we're in danger of going too far in the feminine? Do you understand?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I struggle with this idea of too far in the feminine, again, because it sets up these value judgments around masculinity and femininity around people. But I think, what we see in Zuckerberg and some of these other comments is a form of pushback. There has been a resistance to gender equality ad infinitum forever. Really. You have to go back to the suffragettes. There was resistance to it then, and we've got research dating back 50 years that looks specifically at the different kinds of resistance and backlash and pushback against gender equality that come primarily from men. A lot of it recently has been covert. I think my research was looking at that as well, the way the men responded, particularly to #MeToo and Black Lives Matter as well, which was very much about presenting a kind of acceptable identity within the context of the critiques of what #MeToo and Black Lives Matter and the conversation around white privilege was saying. So this presentation of an acceptable white middle class masculinity, whilst at the same time continuing to reinforce old patriarchal tropes and sort of to maintain privilege. And there's more research in the last 10 years across Iceland, America, New Zealand, and some more in the UK that demonstrates the same kind of process. They refer to it as a hybrid masculinity, where you present this, we support gender equality, but underneath it, we're reinforcing patriarchal norms. But what Zuckerberg is demonstrating, I think, is a more overt form of resistance. And I think Trump legitimizes that overt form of resistance in the way that he behaves. And there is a lot of research as well out there that says that much of the resistance is seeking back to a kind of idealized past where inequality was normalized, where the patriarchal norms. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing here with Trump, with Zuckerberg, is harking back to that. And there's more research that talks about this masculine overcompensation in relation to gender equity perceived as a threat. So a lot more homophobic stuff, a lot more sexist stuff, a lot more right-wing politics as well, which is quite interesting when we think about, I know Gen Z is one of the things that comes up as well in terms of the shift to the right of young men. But there is this overcompensation, masculine overcompensation as a response to gender equity as a threat. And I think that's kind of a little bit of what we see in Zuckerberg and certainly in Trump, that they're trying to recreate this old patriarchal order. Yeah. And Trump legitimizes it and legalizes it as well.
Yeah. Really nice comments coming in here from Berengeres, forgive me if I'm pronouncing your name wrongly, saying, like the idea of just qualities associated with humanity. And Seb as well saying a man should be allowed to be kind and compassionate just as much as a woman should be allowed to be bold and assertive. So annoying for Zuckerberg to compartmentalize like that. So absolutely. If we're trying then to reframe, I was going to say to reframe masculinity, but it sounds like almost to reframe both masculinity and femininity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In a way that promotes healthier workplace behaviors, in a way that works for everyone, where we don't have to think necessarily in these binary terms. How do we go about doing that? Because it sounds like we're almost having to go back to basics of what the definitions. Maybe we need to almost throw out some of these definitions.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's throw it all out. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's a big job, right? Because these distinctions have been built into us. We've been socialized to subscribe to these distinctions between this is man, this is woman, for hundreds of years, and it continues today. So they're deeply ingrained. But I do think we kind of need to move away from those ideas that only men can be like this, or men should be like this, and men and women should be like this, and that there are value judgments ascribed to these. And that's one of the real issues here, is that these narratives have ascribed a greater degree of social value, and certainly in terms of leadership and commerce, etc., to these masculine characteristics. So we need to get away from that ascription of social value. But there is a quite a complex issue here in terms of identity and how we know who we are, how we identify. And that's, we don't have time to go into the depths of this today, but essentially we know who we are in a large part because of who we're not. Right? So I know I'm a man because I'm not a woman, because of these different definitional qualities that I've been taught, okay, that exist outside of any kind of physical difference. It's about characteristic and behavioral difference as well. Now, if we start saying, well, men, you have to be more like women, how does a man know that he's a man? And that's a real threat. It's almost an existential threat to my sense of self. And that can elicit and generate sort of fear responses and pushback responses as well. But I think we also have to, when we're talking about reframing masculinity, we have to think about reframing femininity. If this job of just getting rid of masculine and feminine characteristic traits is a longer term one. Because what we have to understand here is that those narratives around masculinity that say that men have to be rational and unemotional and strong and be the breadwinner are the same discourses that marginalize women, right? They're the same ones. So the breadwinner discourse is the same discourse that says women should stay at home and look after the children and be dependent on the man's income, right? The narrative that says men have to be strong and brave is the same one that says women are weak and need the protection of men. So, you know, these narratives are not separate. They are the same one. And so we need to think about how we change all of that in order to get rid of those value judgments, in order to get rid of that kind of inequitable perspective on men and women in general.
Yeah. I'm really mindful that, of course, once we open this up, it's such a big topic. But if we then bring those thoughts back to the workplace, and particularly for organizations who are wrestling with some of this, if they're thinking about how do we take the best of both, how do we think about shaping and reinforcing a constructive approach where we're taking all of the positive leadership qualities that don't need to be ascribed in one direction or the other. This must be the work that you're doing day to day with organizations saying, help us with this stuff.
Yeah.
So, what are you noticing?
I mean, again, it's about how you articulate leadership qualities without making them gendered. And how you articulate that as this is applicable to anybody, irrespective of who you are, irrespective of what your gender identity is or any other kind of identity. And I think there are some mechanisms through which organizations can do that, which is about their internal comms and how it's modeled in terms of what we're talking about as ungendered leadership qualities, if you like. But I do think that there is more work that needs to be done internally in organizations in the sense of moving men into a position of supporting gender equity, because we can't forget in all of this that, you know, the data still exists that says that women are fundamentally marginalized in the workplace, whether that's around experiencing microaggressions or a lack of psychological safety that I know Shape Talent's own research was identifying across Europe, or whether that's about the gender pay gap, etc. These structural issues still exist. And so we do need to move men into a position of supporting that work. And there is research that says the more men are aware of gender inequality, the data, the specifics of it, the more likely they are to support the work. Now, there's a caveat here, though, is that how that is communicated can't be or shouldn't be communicated in a way that makes men feel guilty or as if they're the entirety of the problem or threatened, because that causes negative reactions. From my perspective, as you'll probably anticipate, it needs to be communicated in a way that engenders a sense of responsibility and accountability to say, look, we morally need to do something about this here. But as I said, there is research to demonstrate that when you work with men in that way, they will move towards working on gender equity. And of course, we mustn't forget in all of this, because one of the problems that has existed, I think, is that men have kind of been left out of the conversation in some respects. And what men experience on a day-to-day basis or in the corporate world has been left out of the conversation as well. And I think that needs to be included with the understanding that it's done intersectionally. So again, that we don't just talk about the struggles of men, but what we do is we say, well, look, a lot of this data is looking at the experiences of, for example, working class men or black or brown men or gay men or whatever, the intersectional nature of it, because I think, you know, we'll struggle to find real structural systemic oppression of men in general, right? But we will find it where it exists intersectionally. And that needs to be part of the conversation too.
Yeah, so real nuance needed here, which is sometimes hard for organizations, you know, to grapple with. I wonder, you were saying, you know, of course, that it's hugely important to bring men into this conversation. We called this masculinity in the workplace and how men benefit from gender equity. And I wonder, when we're thinking about men's engagement and making sure that they're part of the conversation, what do you see as some of the common misconceptions that men may have about gender equity initiatives, and how organizations might address those? Because as you said, sometimes it feels like they're just being like, you're the problem, you need to sit inside while we sort this out, this mess that you've made. And that, of course, is just going to alienate people.
Yeah, well, I think one of the big misconceptions is that it's a zero-sum game. You know, that's a massive misconception that the achievement of equality for women means that men lose out. And that simply isn't the case. You know, gender equality benefits men, perhaps not as much as women, I don't know, but it does benefit men. You know, we have to look at the reality that, you know, when you have examples of gender equity, we look at the Scandinavian countries in particular that are more gender equal, and how that benefits men as well, in terms of psychologically, in terms of in relationships, in terms of in the workplace. So we need to understand that it's not a zero-sum game. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. I think this idea of men being blamed is problematic, because there has been some narrative that seems to blame men as individuals. At the same time, men need to be accountable and responsible for what's happened. But I think, excuse me, in terms of organizations, and we talked about bringing men into this as well, I think what's really important is the dialogue. It's about having the conversation. I think for organizations wanting to look at how you address some of the misconceptions and address some of the resistances, it's very much about having spaces where men can have dialogue about their experiences, but also about gender equity and gender inequality in a way so that they can express what they're feeling about it. But it has to, again, be done with a kind of idea of asking critical questions about it, rather than allowing it to become something that adds more weight to the pushback. But men have been, to one degree or another, excluded from those conversations. And so I think that's a really important part of the conversation moving forward.
Yeah. So let's lean into that moving forward piece about, if we want truly inclusive workplaces. I know something you talk a lot about is critical consciousness. Maybe you can say a little bit more about what that means in the context of the workplace and the corporate culture, and how it informs this discussion.
Sure. So critical consciousness comes from the work of Paulo Freire in Latin America. And it effectively means being aware of your social position in relation to systems of power based on your intersectional identity, based on who you are. So white middle-class heterosexual men will always be closer to power in the current context than white working-class women or white working-class men. So it's about being cognizant of your relationship and your position to power, and being able to critically reflect. It's one of the key components of critical consciousness, is having the ability and the space to critically reflect on what that means and how that affects what you do and how you engage in the workplace and engage with other people. So that it's this idea of critically reflecting on you and power systems, and then engaging with the idea of efficacy, that the idea that I can do something about this, to be accountable and responsible, but from a critical perspective, and working with that to take action, right? So critical consciousness, applying a critical reflective thought to the situation and then doing something about it. You know, the three components are critical reflection, critical efficacy, and critical action, because there's no point critically reflecting, there's no point understanding that you could do something about it if you don't actually do anything about it. And again, there is more research that says men who engage in critical consciousness and develop a critical consciousness are less likely to have sexist attitudes, and interestingly are more likely to develop what have been termed as healthier masculinities, because there is a process of critically reflecting on self, which involves a critical reflection on these ideas of masculinity. So a critical reflection on those narratives that say you have to be rational and unemotional, that frees men up to be emotional, to demonstrate vulnerability. So you get this kind of dual impact of moving men into a space where they take action, because part of it is learning more about gender inequality, which, as we already know, induces men to take action, but critical action. So you have more men moving into that space of taking action. You have more men developing a healthier or more positive masculinity, if we're going to go down that road.
Yeah. as I suspected would happen, time is running away from us. I've got so many more questions that I'd like to ask Matt, and I'm going to ask him one more, but then I'm going to give a chance for others to put some questions. So if you have something you'd like to ask Matt, we've sort of dropped a thread of breadcrumbs there, lots of places where I could have stopped and spent lots more time with Matt, because I know he's sort of got so much to say on this. But if there's something we've touched on that you want to hear a little bit more about, or if you have a fresh question, now's your chance to get it into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that while I carry on, because we could go all day here, Matt. But that piece around critical consciousness then, practical steps. We're always thinking, well, we've understood, we've started to kind of engage with the topic, but for people who are sitting here who are, you know, in HR, they're head of people, they're involved in EDI, thinking this sounds really interesting, but that also sounds like some quite deep work. That sounds like I'm going to need quite a lot of psychological safety. Or how do people take some of these concepts and actually start to implement them, get involved with them in their workplace? What's the kind of work you're doing?
I mean, it's so this is the kind of work that I'm doing, and you know, it operates at a number of different levels. So you can work individually, so the one-to-one coaching, so the specific one-to-one coaching that looks not just at inclusion but at critical consciousness and the development of it, and that creates that space. And it's particularly important in this work that leadership has that ability to apply critical consciousness, because modeling and also filtering it down from on high is really important. So creating that kind of safe space for leaders to talk about this. But then there is group work, and I think it's quite interesting to look at. So we do a series of facilitated dialogue sessions, which does what it says on the tin. This is about bringing people together into a room which is confidential, it's judgment free, to talk about their fears or their concerns or their resistances or their support, whatever it might be, in a space in which generally it's me in that space who will then ask questions. And I think it is quite important that you've got somebody who knows how to ask those questions, but also has subject specialism. You know, when we're talking about this, I think it's quite important to have that in that space. But it creates a safe and confidential space to people to begin to articulate their views, but then also that process of beginning to critically reflect. You ask the right question. You know, the coaches out there will understand, you know, that question, what assumptions are you making? Why are you making? Where did that assumption come from? Little questions like that begin to encourage people to question. And I found this with my research. It's what I did with my respondents. And I had, and these are people that expressed some fairly unsavory views towards the end, towards the end of the process. A number of them were, I'm beginning to change how I think about this. So it does work, but you have to do it in that space. So there's dialogue sessions. And I think there's also a really interesting model around using action learning sets if you want to think about how you embed this into your organization. So you can look at critical action learning sets, but it brings people together to, again, initially have those discussions. You can expose those discussions, dig into them, find out about them, and then develop, okay, how do we solve this? How do we then test those ideas? And this is what critical action learning sets is about. How do we test those ideas? How do we come back and discuss our learning, evolve our learning, and move on? But crucially, that's embedded into a sort of organizational learning hierarchy, so it spreads out. And that's quite sort of resource effective, if you will, because it has that almost organic learning as well as that organic process of change. So I think all of these are different ways that organizations can get involved in this process and begin to develop a different way of understanding men and women in the space and the relationships, and begin to address some of the inequities that exist.
Yeah, and I really like that link between, you know, the conversation, the dialogue is the starting point, but then once you've surfaced people's feelings and thoughts and challenges, what you do with those and the action learning sets piece. Thank you. I can see some questions have come in, so I shall park my question at that point, which is, really interesting one here, which you and I have talked about previously. This is coming from Jessica. Thank you. I'm thoughtful about a lot of the noise I'm hearing about Gen Z disengagement. So just wondering whether you've come across any data or research which kind of explains why we're getting essentially what people are saying is this kind of pushback where Gen Z are saying, and you mentioned it earlier, slight maybe a move sort of more towards the right. Younger men saying, well, hang on a minute, this is not, you know, there's nothing to do with me. I can't have this guilt. This is people, you know, decades ago. Why am I now suffering the zero-sum game? So what do you think is happening here?
I think it's a really complex question. I mean, there is research out there. Ipsos has done some research looking at it, and it's quite interesting when you look at different Gen Z type research, because not so long ago it was saying that Gen Z was more liberal, and now it's saying that Gen Z is more right wing. Particularly, you should emphasize it's particularly young men in the Gen Z generation are more right wing rather than women. But I think we have to understand, and we have to look at this from a slightly different. Those of us that didn't grow up in the social media world have to kind of understand what's happened here. You know, young people in Generation Z were born into and brought up with social media as their prime source of information. But we know that social media is driven by algorithms. It's not a neutral place in terms of how you access your information. And as soon as you ask a question about masculinity, or you mention Andrew Tate because you're curious, your algorithms will start putting more and more and more of that stuff in front of you. And so young people have been born into and raised in that era. At the same time, and I know this is the case for England, Britain, and I think it's more across Europe as well, there's been a massive reduction in funding for youth provision. Right. So in the first 10 years of Generation Z, there's been a £1 billion reduction in youth service provision in Britain, £1 billion. And I think something like 2,500 youth centres and families children's centres have closed. So where do young people go? You know, when you're an adolescent, you're already in the depths of hormonal, who am I? Where do you go? There isn't any youth provision to do it. So you back online, and you're then back subject to the vagaries of people like Andrew Tate and the algorithms that put more and more and more of that stuff in front of you. And then, of course, you've got lockdown. Yeah. Right. You've got lockdown, which really put everybody online and made everybody more susceptible to that stuff. But I also think that one of the factors here is, and this is kind of alluded to, is the degree to which things like #MeToo and Hollaback and those other campaigns that were saying, look, men, you cannot behave like this anymore, alongside a much higher prevalence of narrative and discussion around gender identity and gender theory and transgender, etc., has created a fairly high level of uncertainty. How do I know who I am? How do I know how to be a man? What is it to be a man? There's all of this stuff going on. We know from the #MeToo times, so many men were saying, I don't know how to behave anymore, which was part of a kind of pushback and resistance to it. But there's a kernel underneath that of truth, because there's no clarity. And just as an aside, that is one of the things about inclusion and EDI in general, is that it rarely talks about what it means for those people that have privilege, right? When we talk about EDI, we often talk about how the world needs to be for people who are marginalized or disadvantaged. We rarely talk about what that means for people like me in that world, right? What's my place in that world? And that uncertainty adds this idea of threat and pushback. But back to Gen Z, you've got that confluence of all of these different elements that come together. So in some ways, it's hardly surprising that young men who are having these questions about how to be men are, through these algorithms, being fed a kind of patriarchal, misogynistic and right-wing narrative. And all of that does fit with a broader right-wing narrative that's out there, the stuff that Trump's been going on about. But it's not just Trump, it's across the whole of Europe, which in many ways is seeking to kind of reconstitute this kind of patriarchal family norm. You know, a lot of the stuff around single parenthood, a lot of the stuff around women's rights over their bodies, etc., which is across Europe, is trying to reconstitute this old school patriarchal family norm, both societally at a state level as well as a family level. Yeah. And so these young men are then getting more and more drawn into this certainty of manhood within the context of a right-wing narrative. And I think that speaks to what's been going on there to an extent.
Yeah, thank you. Gosh, I think we can have one more question. Let's see how we go. But really interesting question here from Don. Don, thanks for your question. About allyship, male allyship programs, Matt. So Don's curious about your take on those. Some feel, he says, they may come across as male blaming and suggest making them gender inclusive. However, we notice that all gender programs often end up dominated by women and minorities. So how do we get the whole male allyship? Again, a big question. How do we fix that, Matt? But are you recognizing any of that? Those?
Well, yeah. I mean, Hi, Dom. Thanks for the question. I mean, I have a slight issue with the concept of or the terminology around allyship, because I think it expresses a kind of power and equity in and of itself. You know, I'm going to be your ally in your struggle, And I think
I'm here to help because I've got I'll sort it.
Yeah. And it can engender this sort of benevolent sexism that also appears in the literature around, you know, I'm for you, I'm going to help you out. It's a bit like the masculine version of white saviorism, if you will. But that's kind of my personal engagement with it. What I do think is that there does need to be work, and as I say, you know, we need to bring men into the equation. Men, you know, if we're going to have a solution to gender equality, men need to be part of that equation. Should it be men only spaces? Should it be all gender spaces? I think potentially there's a progression. I think initially there is a need for some men only spaces to have those conversations, but they have to be done in the right way. You know, they have to be held in the right way, to ensure that they're critical, to ensure that it comes out of there not as reinforcing ideas and feelings, but as actually coming out with actions to take action. And I think they need to be concrete actions as well. I mean, some of the other critiques of the allyship program is that they can kind of create a situation where, you know, men will make space for women in the meeting. Isn't that nice of us, right? And it stops there. Or, you know, there are these kind of small steps, small, almost tokenistic gestures that don't actually contribute hugely towards systemic change, because that's what we need here is systemic change. Right. So I think, again, yes, spaces for men to talk together, to work out what to do, to how to deal, to work through their issues and their ideas and their thoughts and their feelings, but to come out there with action. But then also, I think it's really important. You know, for me, this is an all of us issue. That's part of my catchphrase, if you will. Inclusion is an all of us issue, because in reality, if we step away slightly from just looking at gender, there are very few people in Western society or across the world that don't experience some kind of discrimination. Those are people who are like me, you know, because we are the locus of intersectional privilege, you know, because I'm white, because I'm middle class, because I'm a man, because I'm middle aged, because I'm heterosexual, I'm not I'm neurotypical, and I'm not disabled by society. But if you actually look at the numbers, the vast majority of people, men and women, and non-binary and transgender, have an intersection of some privilege and some disadvantage. So it affects all of us. So at some point, all of us have to get in the room, and all of us have to kind of work together to design and decide what are we going to do tomorrow, and what's the future of the workplace as well as the future of society. I don't know if that answers Dom's question or if it's just me going off on one, but
really interesting. This is a topic where we all want to go off on, just because it's so big, and I can see we're almost at time. There's some great, a few other questions coming in, as well as some lovely feedback from people. So rest assured, if your question hasn't been answered, then I know Matt will get involved in the chat afterwards. People are very welcome to contact you as well. Matt, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Well, I mean, find me on LinkedIn and DM me, or you can go to my website and there's an email address there, or I'm quite happy to put my own email address into the chat, and you can ping me an email there. So multiple ways. Brilliant.
Well, maybe I'll let you think about that while I'm just wrapping up, because there's some really great comments. Thanks, Emily. Emily saying brilliant session. Thank you so much. Matt is excellent. There's a question here about resources. I'm sure we can look at that. And talking of resources, actually, we're going to do more on this. Obviously, Matt is an expert. He's very happy to engage with you. Here at Shape Talent, the whole issue of men and gender equity is very much on our mind at the moment. And we have a blog that I think Sharon, our founder, already dropped into the chat. But Men and Gender Equity, Creating Better Workplaces for Everyone. As Matt was saying, it's an all of us issue, but that blog, do have a look at that. And if it's something you'd like to learn more about, then go on this journey with us, because coming up, we have in May, we will be running a workshop for EDI professionals looking at this whole issue. We'll have a webinar in June that we're planning on this topic. So lots of places you can connect, learn more. So I would really encourage you to, if you're not already, follow Shape Talent and our founder and CEO, Sharon Peake, here on LinkedIn. But also, if you go to our website, you can sign up for our newsletter. And once we finalized all the dates and times, you will be the first to hear about that webinar, that workshop, so that you can continue to engage. And let's keep this conversation going. I've loved seeing what's happening in the chat, some really powerful reflections, some great questions. So whether you're watching live or on replay, get involved in the chat. We will continue to engage with it. Matt is very happy to engage with your questions. So thank you so much. Just remains for me to say, Matt, thank you so much. We could have gone another hour or so on this. I know your research is vast and really in depth, and you're more than happy to kind of go deeper on this with people if they'd like to. So thank you for your time and sharing your expertise. Final date for People's Diary is next month's LinkedIn Live. We'll be breaking barriers again, and we will be doing that at 10 o'clock on Tuesday, the 15th of April. I will be in conversation with Shape Talent's founder and CEO. I already mentioned her. She's here. She's on the chat. Sharon Peake, the great Sharon Peake, who is tackling the topic of EDI in uncertain times, when doing the right thing gets complicated. And as Matt and I have touched on today, you know, we're seeing movement in this space, and not all of it is easy or comfortable. There's pushback, there's big discussions opening up. So Sharon will be having a look at all of that, particularly, obviously, as always, from an organizational perspective. When this stuff gets tricky, and it does, what should organizations be doing? What are their options? What are some of the approaches that we are encouraging and helping people to think through? So we would love you to join us for that. Please stay in touch, keep talking, and thank you very much indeed. And thanks to you, Matt, again. Cheerio, everybody. Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.